A Roman emperor, alone in his tent at night, writing notes to himself that he never intended anyone else to read. A former slave, teaching lessons on freedom from a small room in Greece, on a leg that was broken and never properly healed. A statesman, sentenced to death by the very emperor he had once advised, spending his final hours writing calmly about how to face it. None of them called themselves self-help gurus. They called themselves Stoics. And the philosophy they built, not in comfort but to survive plague, exile, slavery, and the collapse of everything they had, is today quietly shaping how millions of people think about anxiety, failure, and control. The breathing exercise your therapist taught you, the journaling app on your phone, the line, "Control what you can control," that every coach in every locker room repeats without knowing where it came from. All of it traces back to three men who never met each other, living lives you would not wish on anyone. This is the real story of Stoicism, not the quote card version, the one built under pressure. Stoicism began around 300 BCE, and it began with a disaster. A merchant named Zeno was sailing a cargo of expensive purple dye from Phoenicia when his ship wrecked off the coast of Greece. He lost everything, not metaphorically. Everything he owned was at the bottom of the sea, and he washed up in Athens with nothing left to trade and no way home. Wandering the city with no plan, he stepped into a bookshop and picked up a text on Socrates. Something in it stopped him cold. He asked the shopkeeper where he could find a man who thought like that. As it happened, a philosopher was walking past the shop at that exact moment, and the shopkeeper pointed him out. Zeno followed him. That accident, a shipwreck, a bookshop, a stranger walking past at the right second, became the entire foundation of a philosophy that would outlast the empire it was born in. Zeno began teaching under a public colonnade in the Athens marketplace, a painted porch called the Stoa Poikile. Students gathered under that roof because it was free, open to the public, and available to anyone regardless of class. That detail matters more than it seems. From its very first day, this was not a philosophy built in a palace for people with comfortable lives. It was built in the open air by a man who had lost his fortune. For anyone willing to stand and listen, the name stuck to the place before it stuck to the ideas. Stoicism, philosophy of the porch. Built by a man with nothing, for people who assumed they had nothing to gain from philosophy either. 3 centuries after Zeno, Stoicism reached its 3 most important teachers, and they could not have lived more different lives. The first was an emperor. Marcus Aurelius ruled the most powerful empire on earth, commanded its armies, and held more unchecked power than almost any human being in history. Power like that corrupts nearly everyone who holds it. Marcus used Stoic philosophy as a daily discipline specifically to prevent that. Each night, often from a military tent on some frozen frontier, fighting wars he never wanted, he wrote private notes to himself, not for an audience, not for publication. Reminders to stay humble, stay useful, stay sane, addressed to no one but himself. Those notes survived by accident and are now known as Meditations, one of the most read books in human history, written by a man who never intended a single reader. The second was the opposite of an emperor in every possible way. Epictetus was born enslaved. His own master is said to have broken his leg, and Epictetus walked with a permanent limp for the rest of his life as a result. Eventually freed, he built an entire philosophy centered on one radical idea: that no one, not an emperor, not a master, not the state itself, can control your mind unless you allow it to. A man with almost nothing external ever taken from him again, because he had already decided what could and could not be taken. He never wrote a word down himself. Everything we have of Epictetus was recorded by a student who simply refused to let the lectures disappear. The third was Seneca, a statesman who advised an emperor, amassed enormous wealth, and lived a life of real political danger. He wrote some of the clearest, most practical Stoic letters we have, essays on anger, on the shortness of life, on facing hardship without flinching. And then the philosophy he had spent decades writing about was tested directly. Accused of conspiracy by the very emperor he had once tutored, Seneca was ordered to end his own life. Ancient sources describe him meeting that order with remarkable composure, dictating final thoughts to those around him rather than begging or panicking. An emperor, a former slave, a condemned statesman. Three completely different circumstances, arriving at the same conclusions about how to live. When a philosophy holds up across all three of those lives, at the very top of power, at the very bottom of it, and at the moment of losing everything including life itself, it has earned the right to be taken seriously. At the center of everything these three men wrote is one idea, deceptively simple, repeated so often across Stoic texts that it functions almost like a foundation stone. Some things are up to us, some things are not. Your judgments, your desires, your effort, your choices about how to respond to what happens to you. These, the Stoics argued, are entirely yours. No one can take them, no external force can touch them. Your health, your reputation, other people's opinions of you, the outcome of an exam you already studied for, a job interview you already gave everything to, a diagnosis that has already been made. These are not up to you. You can influence them. You cannot fully control them. And treating them as though you can is, in the Stoic view, the single biggest source of unnecessary suffering in a human life. Epictetus opened his entire teaching with this distinction because he understood it from the most extreme possible angle. A man who has lost his freedom, his body's full function, and his legal status as a person, and still insists that his mind remains entirely his own, is not offering comfortable philosophy. He is offering the most tested version of it that exists. Here's what makes this idea so durable. It is not a claim that hardship does not matter. It is a claim about where to spend your energy. Grief over an outcome you already tried your best to prevent changes nothing except your own state of mind. Energy spent controlling your effort, your attention, your reaction, changes everything within your reach. Picture two hands. One is closed around smoke, gripping tighter and tighter, and the smoke slips through anyway, no matter how hard the grip. The other hand is open, working steadily, shaping something solid it actually has the power to shape. Nearly every piece of Stoic advice that exists is some version of that image, applied to a different situation. A relationship, a career setback, a death. Different situation, same one distinction over and over for 2,000 years. The Stoics made a claim that still makes people uncomfortable today. Wealth, health, status, and reputation are not actually good or bad in themselves. They called these things indifference. Not because they don't matter at all. A Stoic would still rather be healthy than sick, still take a job over unemployment, but because none of them are what actually makes a life good or bad. You can hold all of them and still live badly. You can lose all of them and still live well. What determines which one happens is not the external thing itself, it is what you do with it. The only true good in this framework was virtue. And virtue, to the Stoics, was not vague niceness. It broke into four specific disciplines. Wisdom, seeing situations clearly, without self-deception. Courage, acting rightly even when it costs you something. Justice, treating other people the way their humanity actually deserves, not the way is convenient. Temperance, mastering your own appetites instead of being run by them. Everything else, every possession, every promotion, every relationship, was simply material to practice those four disciplines on. Wealth was not good or bad. It was an opportunity to practice generosity or an opportunity to practice greed, depending entirely on the person holding it. A crisis was not good or bad. It was an opportunity to practice courage or an opportunity to fall apart, depending entirely on the person facing it. This reframe is more radical than it first sounds because it removes the excuse that circumstances determine your character. A wealthy Roman senator and an enslaved teacher were, in this framework, working with the exact same material for building a good life. Different raw ingredients, identical task. The Stoics did not avoid thinking about death. They built entire daily practices specifically designed to think about it more, not less. Memento mori. Remember, you will die. It sounds bleak stated flatly like that, but it was never meant as despair. It was a tool for cutting through noise. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that he could leave this life at any moment, not to frighten himself, but to force clarity about what was actually worth his attention today. This hour, this conversation, rather than some imagined future where he would finally get around to living properly. Roman households sometimes kept small memento mori objects in plain view, a skull carved into a mosaic, an hourglass on a desk, a quiet daily reminder standing in the middle of ordinary life. Not a horror image, clarifying one. Time is finite, so spend it on what matters, not on what's merely urgent. Paired closely with Memento Mori was another idea, amor fati, love of fate. Not passive resignation, but something more demanding. Meeting whatever actually happens, the promotion or the layoff, the good diagnosis or the bad one, without wasting energy wishing reality were different than it already is. Wishing does not change what already happened. It only adds a second layer of suffering on top of the first one. Put together, these two practices form a single discipline. Remember that time is short, so act with urgency on what matters. Accept what has already happened, so you stop bleeding energy into a past you cannot revise. Two ancient tools aimed at the exact same modern problem. A mind that either avoids thinking about mortality entirely or dwells on the unchangeable past instead of the very small window of time it actually controls, which is now. None of this stayed abstract for the people who actually lived it. Every major Stoic figure had a physical, repeatable, daily practice, not a belief system they thought about occasionally, but maintenance they performed on the mind the same way you would maintain a body. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself nearly every night, not a diary of events, a review. What did I do well today? Where did I make excuses for myself? What do I need to remember before I need it tomorrow? Meditations, the book the world now reads, was never meant to be read by anyone else. It was raw, private, repeated self-correction, written by a man holding the most power in the known world and using it on no one but himself. Seneca recommended a specific exercise, now sometimes called negative visualization, deliberately imagining loss in advance. Picture the wealth gone, picture the position gone, picture the person you love no longer there. Not to induce anxiety, but to drain a future hardship of its shock value before it ever arrives, so that if it does arrive, it meets a mind that has already, in some small way, rehearsed it. Epictetus taught a similar discipline aimed at desire itself. Before wanting anything, ask honestly whether it belongs to the category of things actually up to you. A promotion depends on other people's decisions. Your effort toward earning it does not. Train the mind daily to notice which category a given want falls into, and disappointment starts losing its grip. None of these were theories to be admired from a distance. They were maintenance, performed daily, the same unglamorous way you would stretch a body before it's asked to perform. The insight was never the hard part. The daily repetition was. 2,000 years later, the same ideas are showing up in locker rooms, boardrooms, and therapy offices, often without anyone in the room knowing where they actually came from. Elite athletes are trained explicitly to separate their effort from an outcome they do not fully control. A missed shot, a bad call, an opponent's lucky break, because dwelling on the uncontrollable wrecks performance on the very next play. That is the dichotomy of control, unnamed, running an entire sport's mental performance training. Executives are coached to make the best decision available with the information they have, and then let the outcome go once it is out of their hands, because replaying a decision that is already made changes nothing except their sleep that night. That is amor fati, unnamed, running entire leadership programs. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most well-supported forms of modern psychological treatment, rests on a foundation that would be instantly recognizable to Epictetus. It is not events themselves that disturb people, but the judgments people attach to those events. A 2,400-year-old teaching from a formerly enslaved philosopher, sitting quietly underneath a modern clinical treatment used by millions of people who have never heard his name. None of this is coincidence. It turns out a philosophy built specifically to survive plague, exile, slavery, and the collapse of an empire translates remarkably well to surviving a difficult performance review or a frightening diagnosis. The conditions the Stoics were built for were simply harder than most of what modern life demands. The tool was already engineered for a heavier load than we usually ask of it. The Stoics never promised an easy life. Not one of the three men in this video got one. What they offered instead was something more durable than ease, a way of thinking that does not depend on things going well. Control what is actually yours. Release what was never yours to begin with. And whatever happens next, the good news or the bad news, the plan working or falling apart, meet it standing up. That is not ancient trivia. It is a working system, tested by an emperor, a slave, and a dying man, and it still runs, quietly, underneath a great deal of what passes for modern self-improvement today. If you want to build this into something more than a video you watched once, that is exactly what daily reflection is for. Becoming Stoic is a free app built around that same daily practice, a modern version of the notebook Marcus Aurelius wrote in every night. If this changed how you think about where control what you can control actually came from, subscribe. There's a great deal more of this philosophy still to unpack.